Listen carefully. This story was never meant to survive. If it reached you, it means someone failed to finish the job. Somewhere in the ashes of history, a voice that was silenced for decades finally learned how to whisper, and what it revealed was so corrosive that men trained for war couldn't stand to hear it. That whisper is coming for you now. They called her a giant not because of what she did, but because of what she endured. She stood taller than memory itself, taller than the lies that tried to bury her. And for 18 years, she never spoke a single word. Not in the fields, not under the lash, not when hunger hollowed her bones. Silence became her last possession, the one thing power could not confiscate. Until the day it broke. You've been taught that history is written by victors. That's a half-truth. The deeper truth is darker. History is edited by systems that survive by controlling what men are allowed to know. Courthouses burn. Records vanish. Testimonies are labeled inconvenient, obscene, destabilizing. Not because they are false, but because they expose the machinery beneath civilization. What happened to this woman threatened to expose something too familiar, too structural, too timeless. This is not just a story about slavery. That word is too small. This is about ownership of bodies, ownership of bloodlines, ownership of silence. This is about how institutions learn to turn trauma into compliance, pain into property, and women into infrastructure for someone else's future. It is about how power thinks in generations, not years, and how obedience is engineered long before a child can speak. The plantation was not just land. It was a laboratory, and the master was not just a man, but an idea given flesh. The belief that some lives exist solely to be shaped, harvested, and erased. The giant woman was selected not randomly, but deliberately. Her body, her silence, her broken gaze, all of it assessed like equipment. You need to understand this. Monsters rarely look like chaos. They look like order, ledgers, columns, plans. As I pull you deeper, you're going to feel unease, not because this is unfamiliar, but because it is. You will recognize the pattern. You will see how the past never dies. It just changes uniforms. And when this woman finally spoke, she didn't scream. She whispered, because whispers travel further in systems built on fear. Remember this as we descend. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. And pressure, given enough time, always finds a way to speak. She arrived on Greenbryer Plantation in the heat of August, the kind of heat that makes the air thick and the soil sticky with decay. Imagine a woman standing over 6.5 feet tall, shoulders broad, hands so large they could crush a man's skull as easily as a gourd. Yet she moves like a shadow, silent, almost mechanical. The other slaves stared. They had seen strong women before, but never one so impossibly still, so utterly unreadable. She had a name, Sarah, but it was barely whispered. More a label than a life. Her master, Nathaniel Crowther, a man whose obsession with control bordered on ritual, examined her with the precision of a scientist. He measured her teeth, her hands, her limbs. He studied the lines of her body as if she were a specimen and calculated what she could produce, what she could endure, what the future could be if he owned her entirely. He had lost his wife years before, leaving him with a plantation to run and a hunger for power that went far beyond money. Crowther believed he could rewrite nature itself. He believed he could breed obedience. And in Sarah he saw the perfect instrument. Her silence did not disturb him. On the contrary, it fascinated him. To a man like Crowther, silence was a promise. It meant the spirit had been broken, the mind compliant, the body ready. Other slaves, witnesses to countless horrors, instinctively understood the gravity of her stillness. Bess, the matriarch of the quarters, watched her and felt an intuitive horror. This woman's soul was a fortress, built from trauma so deep it had rendered speech impossible. The eyes of Sarah did not look at anyone. They scanned some unseen distance, locked onto secrets only she could fathom. Within weeks, Crowther claimed exclusive control. He isolated her from the other slaves, creating a small cabin where no other human was allowed unless explicitly permitted. Her existence was now solely for his observation, his manipulation, his possession. The overseer, Virgil Stanton, a man who had learned not to question Crowther's methods, simply obeyed. The fieldwork, the routine, the labor all were calculated distractions. At night, Crowther visited, a lantern in one hand, a strap in the other, and whiskey to numb the mechanics of his cruelty. Hours later, he emerged bloodied and satisfied, leaving Sarah alive, silent, and already claimed. Every aspect of her life became a record: measurements, feeding schedules, notes on health and vigor. Crowther's journals read like breeding logs, detailing not love or care, but potential. The other slaves watched and understood in a wordless way. She had been chosen not for her spirit, but for what it could produce. She was the beginning of a cycle, one of 9 daughters, one after the other, all destined to carry the weight of calculation, control, and horror. And in her silence, there was a warning. Systems that think in generations, that plan decades ahead, leave marks that echo long after the first lash. By winter, the first signs of her pregnancy were undeniable. Crowther documented every curve, every change, as though the child in her womb were an experiment rather than a life. He fed her richer food, gave her more water, ensured her body would produce the strongest possible offspring. But strength was never enough. Obedience had to be cultivated alongside it. Every night he visited, every calculated moment of proximity, every whispered threat of discipline, this was the crucible in which he forged compliance. The other slaves watched, their horror growing in tandem with her swollen belly. They understood what was coming because they had seen it before, in fragments, in whispers behind cabin walls. The systematic breaking of women into vessels that produced not just children, but the tools of someone else's ambition. And yet Sarah did not cry. She did not resist with words. Her silence had become her armor, and in it was a terrible kind of strength. Those who looked at her could see it. A fortress of endurance, a will so deep that no cruelty could penetrate fully. Crowther's obsession was methodical. He recorded dates, estimated weights, predicted the child's strength. He thought in generations, plotting out how each daughter would inherit not just her mother's height or musculature, but her silence, her capacity to survive under total domination. Each visit became a ritual, a calculated violation, a demonstration of ownership. This was not just physical. It was psychological engineering. He was teaching the child in her womb that power existed above all else, and that to survive, obedience must be absolute. Yet Sarah's silence carried a secret power of its own. Every whispered threat, every controlled movement, every forced act was absorbed, catalogued not by Crowther, but by her. She was learning, not just enduring. And while the plantation thought her spirit broken, it was quietly mapping the patterns of cruelty, the rhythms of violence, the vulnerabilities of those who wielded power with blind certainty. By the time the first daughter was born, Sarah had already begun a mental ledger of everything, every act, every face, every weakness. The cabin she inhabited became both prison and sanctuary. The walls absorbed the cries that could not escape, the humiliation, the terror, the whispers of unborn daughters learning through her body what the world demanded of them. And in this containment, the seeds of resistance, quiet, patient, terrifying in their inevitability, were being sown. She was silent, yes, but silence, when understood as strategy, is far more dangerous than speech. Before the first daughter even took her first breath, the plantation had underestimated her. Crowther's calculations were precise, yet he could not see the invisible ledger Sarah carried in her mind, the slow accumulation of knowledge that would one day become testimony. This ledger would outlast ledgers of debt, records of breeding, journals of obsession. And when it finally spoke, it would reveal not just acts of cruelty, but the architecture of control itself. The births began. One daughter, then another, until 9 had been drawn from her body, each one a mirror of the nightmare she had been forced to inhabit. Crowther's journals recorded their heights, their strength, their health. To him, they were experiments, living extensions of his obsession, proof that obedience and power could be engineered through flesh and blood. But to Sarah, each child was both curse and weapon, a silent testament to the depth of her captivity. Each daughter carried within her the memory of the plantation, the pulse of violence, the rhythm of control. Every night, when Crowther visited, the cabin became a chamber of terror. Sarah's daughters learned quickly that survival demanded total compliance. They felt it in the tension of the air, in the weight of their mother's hands, in the unspoken lessons her silence conveyed. The other slaves whispered warnings to one another, but they could not interfere. Bess, the matriarch, could only shake her head at what was unfolding, knowing that the human spirit could be measured, molded, broken, and that Greenbryer was doing all three with ruthless precision. Yet even in the shadow of this systematic cruelty, Sarah was gathering power. Not the kind of power measured in muscle or wealth, but the kind that cannot be confiscated: understanding. She watched Crowther, cataloged his routines, his desires, his vulnerabilities. She memorized every angle of the plantation, every weakness in the walls, every slip in the overseer's watchfulness. Every act intended to crush her spirit was being recorded in the architecture of her mind, piece by piece. One day, this understanding would be weaponized. The plantation itself was a classroom in horror. Sarah's daughters, molded from the start to obey, were being instructed in the mechanics of control before they could speak. Crowther assumed that strength plus silence meant submission. But strength carries memory, and memory carries strategy. The children grew under his gaze and under hers. He did not notice that the eyes of the 9 daughters mirrored not just terror, but awareness. Observing is a form of resistance, and in their observation, they learned everything about the system they were born into. Halfway through this descent, you, the viewer, must anchor yourself in the truth. If you are watching, type in the comments, "The shadow remembers," twice. Not for me, but for you. Let it solidify that you are no longer a passive observer. Let it bind you to the knowledge that obedience is the tool of control, and understanding is the tool of liberation. You are stepping into a world where silence, power, and survival intertwine. What Sarah endured is not just a story, it is a blueprint of control, a map of how domination is engineered, generation by generation, body by body, mind by mind. And as we continue, understand this: you are not merely witnessing history. You are descending into the architecture of oppression, into the mechanics of compliance that still exist today, cloaked in law, culture, and tradition. And the whisper you will hear next is one that will haunt the corridors of your own understanding long after the screen goes dark. By the time the 9th daughter was born, the plantation had become a machine, humming with ritualized control, measured cruelty, and the illusion of order. Crowther recorded everything: weights, heights, reactions, temperaments. Each act of domination was logged, as though he were writing a recipe for perfect obedience. Yet what he failed to account for was the consciousness growing inside his victims. Sarah's mind, stretched over years of enforced silence and relentless observation, had become a vault of forbidden knowledge. She remembered every face, every gesture, every weakness that authority revealed through arrogance. The other slaves began to notice subtle shifts. Sarah no longer flinched when Crowther entered the cabin. Her gaze, once vacant, had hardened into a calm, unreadable focus. She had begun to whisper to her daughters not words of defiance, not rebellion, but encoded lessons. Lessons in endurance, in observation, in strategy. Her silence was no longer passive. It was active. Every glance, every subtle signal became a thread in a tapestry of survival. Crowther thought he was breeding obedience, but unknowingly, he was training a network of awareness, a generation of daughters whose minds were quietly cataloging the architecture of power around them. The plantation's rhythm fields by day, terror by night was a curriculum of control. Every lash, every threat, every act of humiliation was a lesson, a demonstration of authority. Crowther believed dominance was absolute, but absolute power relies on the predictable. Human behavior, even under extreme duress, leaves traces, cracks, openings. Sarah saw them all: the overseer's impatience, the indentured cook's moral hesitation, the plantation clerk's guilty glances when no one watched. She mapped them, stored them, prepared. The psychological dimension was most critical. Crowther didn't just exploit bodies, He exploited minds. By isolating Sarah and her children, by creating dependence, by normalizing violence, he had constructed an entire cognitive ecosystem designed to produce compliant humans. And yet, resistance does not require rebellion, it requires understanding. Each daughter, under Sarah's subtle guidance, learned the invisible rules of control, the mechanisms of fear, the channels through which power flows. She was giving them eyes where none had been permitted before. It is here, at the center of darkness, that you must confront your own perception of power. Systems like Crowther's are not relics. They are templates repeated endlessly in institutions, in corporations, in governments. The question is not whether power corrupts, it always does, but whether you recognize the patterns before you are trapped within them. The next revelation is darker still. Sarah's final whispers, the secrets she entrusted to her daughters, were not just about survival, they were about exposure. About how to make the invisible visible, how to force history to remember what authority tried to erase. And you, watching now, are on the edge of that revelation. Your comprehension will be uncomfortable, even dangerous. The truth does not console. It commands. And Sarah's story is the blueprint of what happens when human endurance meets methodical cruelty, and when the mind learns to turn silence into weaponry. As the daughters grew, Crowther remained oblivious to the quiet evolution taking place beneath his scrutiny. To him, they were predictable, measured, obedient. But Sarah had transformed their silence into a network of awareness. They observed patterns, remembered sequences, anticipated movements. What Crowther mistook for compliance was actually cognition in its purest, most strategic form. Every gesture, every visit, every interaction became data. Every act of cruelty became instruction. By the time the girls were old enough to understand, they carried a catalog of the plantation's weaknesses in their bones. Sarah had mastered the art of hidden communication. A tilt of the head, a shift of weight, the placement of hands, each subtle motion transmitted a lesson, a warning, an encoded strategy. Her daughters, raised under the constant presence of terror, learned to read it all. They understood Crowther's obsessions, his assumptions, his blind spots. They began to internalize the mechanics of control. How fear shapes behavior, how power conceals vulnerability, how obedience can be weaponized against the wielder of authority. Sarah had taken the tools of their oppression and converted them into instruments of insight. The plantation itself became a classroom of forbidden knowledge. Every corner, every locked door, every ledger was a text. Sarah's daughters memorized the schedules of the overseer, the routines of the guards, the timing of Crowther's visits. They cataloged what he valued, what he overlooked, what terrified him most. And while the world outside Greenbryer saw only a plantation of order and prosperity, inside, a subtle revolution of cognition was taking shape, one that relied entirely on silence, observation, and strategic patience. You, the viewer, must understand. This is the core of all enduring resistance. It is not violent, it is not overt, it is invisible. The most dangerous intelligence is often the quietest. When power relies on predictability, observant minds become lethal. Sarah had no army, no weapons beyond her body and her knowledge, but what she built within her daughters was a mental arsenal capable of dismantling the very system that sought to destroy them. And now it is your turn to engage. Twice. Write in the comments, silence is strength. Anchor this knowledge. Let it fuse with your awareness. You are learning the invisible currents of control, the architecture of domination, the methods that the powerful assume will remain secret forever. Sarah's story is not just historical. It is tactical. And the whispers she left behind are a manual, if you know how to read them, for seeing the hidden levers of power in your own life, your own institutions, your own world. Prepare yourself. The descent continues, and the truths ahead are darker, heavier, and far more dangerous than you have yet imagined. By the time Sarah's daughters reached adolescence, Crowther believed he had created perfection, a lineage of obedience, strength, and silence. Yet the reality was far more dangerous for him. Each girl had absorbed not only the lessons of survival but the architecture of domination itself. They could predict the patterns of authority, anticipate cruelty, and discern weakness where Crowther assumed none existed. The plantation's entire hierarchy, overseer, clerks, guards, had been catalogued in their minds, stored like blueprints for a coming reckoning that no one could see. Sarah's strategy was subtle, patient, and methodical. She whispered to her daughters in the quiet hours, teaching them not only how to survive, but how to understand. She showed them that compliance is a language and silence is a weapon. In every nod, every tilt of the head, every unspoken warning, she was passing down knowledge that the master could neither imagine nor intercept. By nurturing observation over reaction, she was building a generation whose minds were immune to fear's most paralyzing effects. Fear in their hands would become insight. Pain would become data. Authority would become visible. The plantation itself was complicit in this transformation. Every act intended to suppress, control, or humiliate inadvertently taught the girls to read systems, exploit timing, and understand human behavior at its most primal. Crowther thought he was molding bodies. Sarah was molding cognition. He thought he was asserting absolute dominion. She was orchestrating awareness that would outlive every ledger, every whip mark, every ritualized demonstration of power. By the time the daughters were old enough to speak, their voices were quiet but charged with understanding, and ready to unleash knowledge the master had assumed would die with silence. You must see this as more than historical cruelty. This is a pattern repeated across centuries. Systems of control that believe absolute power rests in compliance, while the truly dangerous intelligence is hidden, quiet, patient. Sarah's story is a lens to see it. Every whispered secret, every subtle observation, every encoded strategy is a weapon in the hands of the unseen. And the lessons she instilled in her daughters transcend time. They are tactics for anyone who seeks to see the hidden levers of power before being crushed by them. The next part of the story reveals the moment when the calculated invisibility of knowledge becomes explosive. It is here that silence transforms from survival into revelation. And you, who are descending with me, are now at the edge of that transformation. Remember, what you are about to witness is dangerous. It is knowledge that can reshape perception, upend assumptions, and forever alter the way you understand control itself. The final whispers came not as screams, but as confessions delivered in fragments, in moments too fleeting for the untrained ear to capture. When Sarah spoke finally, she did not recount the acts of cruelty for shock. She revealed the blueprint behind them, the mechanisms, the strategies, the architecture of dominance that had been applied methodically for decades. She whispered the names, the times, the predictable reactions of those who wielded power blindly. Every act that had seemed arbitrary was a lesson in control. Every gesture, every ritualized display of ownership was part of a system that could be understood, predicted, and ultimately dismantled. Her daughters absorbed these whispers like fuel. They were no longer merely survivors, they were archivists of cruelty, custodians of forbidden knowledge, strategists armed with the unseen schematics of authority. Crowther had believed that fear produced obedience, that violence secured loyalty. But he had ignored one constant: intelligence hidden in plain sight. Sarah's lineage carried not just memory, but foresight. The very structure of Greenbryer Plantation, the walls, the fields, the cabins had been memorized, dissected, catalogued. Power's pattern had been decoded. By the time the Union Army arrived, her testimony was already too dangerous. Witnesses who heard fragments could not bear them. The military suppressed her account, destroyed the records, and the woman vanished from official history. Yet her daughters remained, living proof that knowledge could survive when silence protected it. The machinery of domination, the strategies, the logs, the experiments were all visible to those who knew where to look. And they had been trained to look. This is the final lesson. Survival without comprehension is mere existence. But survival with understanding transforms oppression into insight. It turns cruelty into strategy, subjugation into preparation, silence into weaponry. Sarah's story teaches that power, no matter how absolute it seems, always has a pattern. And patterns can be read. Patterns can be predicted. Patterns can be turned against those who wield them. You are now at the edge of that forbidden knowledge. If you have followed her descent, if you have listened to her whispers, your perception has already begun to shift. Authority is no longer opaque. Systems are no longer impenetrable. And the lessons she delivered through silence, through endurance, through carefully nurtured cognition are yours to carry forward. Remember what she taught. Silence is strength, observation is power, and understanding is freedom. History tried to bury it, society tried to erase it, but the truth persists in those who are willing to see, to remember, and to act. You now carry her legacy, and with it, the knowledge that some truths are dangerous because once heard, they change a man forever. Type, "The Shadow Remembers" twice in the comments. Let the knowledge anchor. Share this video with someone who thinks they understand power. Some truths are dangerous, and only the prepared survive them.